Okay, hello everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome to Paddock to Planning, to our seventh webinar. We're just going to let people roll in a couple more minutes and then get started. This is our webinar number 7 in the Paddock to Planning forum series. It's been a bit of a lighter year this year for us, very busy as much as we love to do it. Maybe some of you caught our dairy industry guidelines webinar earlier in the year. But very excited for this one. There's been a lot of interest in this space recently. All right, well, we might just get into it and do some of the front stuff. First of all, an acknowledgement of country. So the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians, the land and waters, and we show our respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. We're committed to providing places in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally, and economically through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. Bit of housekeeping first up. There's a lot of detail in some of these slides, so use a big screen if you can rather than a phone. We love a good discussion, so please add your questions to the chat and we're going to try and get to them at the end, and any that we don't get to will either be sent out like as part of the recording, if we run a bit over time, or we'll try and follow them up and send them out as some of our later kind of information. This session is going to be recorded, so if you do miss anything or you want to pass it around, it's going to be sent out in the weeks after the event. And we don't have our ideas wall up and functioning at the moment. Sorry, we're just changing that platform, but you can still visit our Paddock to Planning website to find information about the previous sessions, and we'll post that later on. As always, we've picked a topic with far too much information to cram into 1 hour, but we hope that between these talks and any of the follow-up resources that we can send out is going to whet your appetite a bit for taking an interest in this space and including it in your work. First up, I'm going to be giving a bit of a framing of processing and logistics as we've categorized it. And then we got two great guests bringing case studies of processing operations. First, that's going to be Steve Lee, the Chief Operating Officer of Marquis Macadamias, and then John Harvie, the Mayor of Murray River Council, who's going to be talking about the Barham micro abattoir that they were really integral in getting set up. All right, we might just crack on now. Processing and logistics. So first of all, let's clarify what we're talking about. Supply chains are very complicated. We've gone with processing and logistics to try and talk about the action that takes place between the farm gate and the final retail or consumer. So agricultural goods can stop at consolidation points like sale yards or packing sheds, or processes, things like abattoirs, mills, and so on. And even though it often occurs somewhat outside of that chain, we also want you to think about agricultural waste processing in similar terms, because it's often very much integrated into the system, feeding back energy and resources. But quickly, why talk about this broad topic at all, especially with these very different parts with different requirements? One thing we're hoping you'll take away is a sense of how consequential this side of the supply chain is to the ag sector, and why it's important to think about it kind of holistically. Those who don't work in agriculture often only experience it as individual points, but this hides that interdependency of these different components, where pressures on one part can have big implications for the function and the resilience of our food and ag system as a whole. And on top of that, there's a lot of benefits to hosting processing facilities and other nodes like that for regional communities, which we're going to go into later. Like agriculture itself, supply chains have undergone a lot of change in the last several decades, with a lot of these trends making a more challenging environment. There's, of course, been larger and larger economies of scale and improvements to logistics, which has resulted in very large, long, and consolidated supply chains. Smaller processors, on the other hand, have been struggling to compete in a lot of cases, and many are shutting. And meanwhile, the transport infrastructure that agriculture relies on has been under pressure from increased usage and climate change. And then on the land use planning side in particular, there's been increasing pressure from land use conflict as you're getting urbanization in historic production and processing areas, and even in rural areas where there's a more proliferation of uses that have competing amenity requirements like rural residential. And an example of land use conflict from the waste processing side is that image you can see there of the AJ Bush and Sons rendering plant in northwest Sydney, which closed last year because of complaints from new urban developments. And it's the only one of its kind in the broader region. So this created a bit of a crisis for independent butcher shops that now either have to pay to send their waste to Queensland for rendering or find an accepting landfill, which is pretty hard and expensive, and it misses a valuable opportunity for recycling into useful products. So why would you intervene among these trends, and what makes processes and the like important for regional communities in particular? First and foremost, they provide security to the local producers who rely on them. Obviously, that's very important, for regional communities in a range of ways. There's, of course, the employment opportunities that come along with them. Processes can also be sites of significant value add and a chance to bring local brands, build local brands, and in the right situation, they're great for the visitor economy. And all this makes them especially important for adapting local industries to changing market conditions. And then also, as we hinted at earlier, they're often sites of waste generation and processing with lots of potential in the circular economy space. And the image from that last one is from the Condong cogeneration plant in the Tweed area. And the plant itself is a great example of a facility that's provided sugarcane growers in the region security in the changing market conditions, because it allows them to convert that cane into biofuels. But the plant operators as well were able to work with council after ex-tropical cyclone Alfred this year to use their facilities to clean up and make use of the green waste that was created then. Like we mentioned earlier, the scale of agriculture has shifted, with a lot of production now taking place in large-scale supply chains, with the smaller scale producers often having to adapt or disappear. From our department's perspective, both ends of this scale are really important for different reasons, and they also bring different kind of benefits for regions. Large-scale productions obviously extremely productive and cheap, and that's the result of decades of advancement in management and technology. But for regions, they also provide significant employment with a big multiplier effect when you're factoring in all the services that surround them. As far as these systems go, probably the most integrated is chicken meat production, like you can see on the diagram on the right there. The processing plants are really big, and they service a large number of associated farms. So Baiada's Handwood plant in the Griffith LGA that you can see, for example, employs something like 700 full-time equivalent workers, and has a throughput of 3.36 million birds per week. So pretty staggering capacity. And that's not even the biggest one in the pipeline at the moment in the state. This huge capacity, though, comes with a lot of specific requirements, and these, along with further consolidation, means that there's a lot of potential for loss of investment to other regions and states. And that means that state and local government have to actively work with these industries if you want to secure that investment. In thinking about how and whether you can accommodate these, that's therefore a really important job for strategic planners in councils that are interested. The best place for information is obviously industry representatives and also our department. But some common factors you might find are secure access to utilities like water and power, access to labour, proximity to producers and other key supply chain components, and appropriate transport networks. So poultry producers, for example, need to be within 2 hours drive of poultry farms to minimize mortalities. And you can kind of imagine then why having routes that have minimal traffic congestion is really important. And last but not least, all these facilities often have inherent potential for impacts beyond their footprint. So having a lack of sensitive receivers in the area is really critical. That image on the left is from a reverse odor modeling exercise for the Namoi Regional Jobs Precinct, where they were looking for suitable land for poultry facilities around Tamworth. And those white dots show dwellings, while the blue shows areas that have at least 1 kilometre distance from these to minimise conflict risk. As you can see, a lot of that landscape then is effectively made unsuitable for these kind of developments on the basis of land use conflict alone. Down at the other end of the scale, like we said, small and medium-sized processors have often struggled as they don't have the economies of scale to compete on price a lot of the time or absorb regulatory costs. Meanwhile, larger facilities like abattoirs have struggled to accommodate smaller and niche producers. And that's an issue you might have heard about on Landline recently with regard to abattoirs or somewhere else, as well. And we'll hear a bit more about that from John later. Despite these challenges, this end of the scale is important for a number of reasons. First of all, even though it's generally not as efficient, there's probably some exceptions that rounds out the food system, providing diversity and resilience, and it can include a lot of products that can't reach the same sort of scale as the poultry industry. They often offer a closer connection to producers. So producers that get locked out of larger supply chains often find they need for access to create their own supply chains. And that's why many of this end of the scale are run as cooperatives, like you're going to hear about in the guest presentation. And this greater agency over the supply chain also allows for bespoke branding and distribution and access to niche and tourist markets. And that includes a lot of producers who have specific environmental practices they want to market, like the organic mill there. The smaller scale and smaller margins often means it's harder for these producers to pick up and move with deep pockets of capital. And this, along with their historic proximity to producers, often means they can be stuck in tricky locations with legacy issues and land use conflict. And you'll see a bit of this, for example, in the Marquis Macadamias case later. And finally, logistics. So like we mentioned, transport technologies have improved a lot. And this has enabled that industry consolidation and longer supply chains. And this efficiency in that sphere has kind of been a major factor in the cost effectiveness of modern food systems. But this comes along with several challenges, including internal ones, like logistical limitations and degradation from greater road capacities, but also external ones like greater competition from other road users and climate change, which both physically degrades and disrupts infrastructure, and also increases emergency use requirements like large fodder deliveries on heavy vehicles during the drought, like you can see with those B doubles there. Obviously, that requires a lot of capacity that's not always available on rural roads. While larger agricultural regions and industries hopefully have had their issues considered in strategies like the REDs, it's still important to try and consider and capture the needs of smaller industries that can slip through the cracks. So Steve has a good example of some niche issues for the macadamia plant coming up. As a summary, we thought we'd rattle off some suggestions on how to bring this into your work. Obviously, not going to be exhaustive, but we hope it's a good starting point. And forgive me too if this is a lot of info, but we're going to be sending this out after the webinar. We've broken it up into a couple of categories. First of all, for strategic planners, you might want to map the full supply chain of industries and identify the critical and the weak points, even outside of your LGA. Investigate the critical mass of producers that processors and other nodes need to sustain themselves. And in doing so, take into account trends like the need for growth. Because if these producers come under constraints like land use conflict or limited opportunities for expansion, this can reverberate through the entire supply chain. Like we said earlier, your council might want to investigate the potential for large-scale processing facilities. And for existing processes and ones that are planned in your region, there might be important landscape buffers to consider and implement through planning controls. Another important general planning control is to make sure there's plenty of primary production and employment zone land for future processing developments, and to minimize dwelling density and other sensitive receivers in and around these areas. And finally, think about the logistic requirements of agriculture when you're identifying new development areas to minimize traffic conflict and to make sure that that road capacity is maintained. For statutory planners, it's important to require some kind of land use conflict risk assessment. We bang on about that a lot for processing facilities and other developments that are nearby them. It's good to be considering emergency requirements of facilities like backup power and water, and you're going to hear some examples of these kind of considerations from the guest speakers. And I don't want this one to sound condescending because I know it's probably already part of your practice, but try and keep an open mind and an inquisitive approach to assessment, because these can be pretty unique developments that might not fit into established boxes. And there's also a lot of new technologies appearing that allow management of impacts at a range of new scales. We'll see some examples of them again in John's presentation later on the Barham Abattoir. For local government in general, there's obviously a range of functions you do that can assist, but some starting points would be working with state governments, like we said, to identify and implement critical road upgrades and repairs. Considering opportunities for supporting smaller processes with grants, with land or joint management schemes. Again, that's going to be a theme of John's presentation coming up. And lastly, working with local producers and processors to identify circular economy opportunities, like, that Condong flour plant example I mentioned before. Once you get out there and talk to them, you might find they have capacities to help with waste issues outside of their normal operations. So with that, I'll hand over to Steve from Marquis Macadamias. But while we do so, if anyone has any examples of small or medium scale processes in your area that the council's provided some assistance to, put it in the chat, and what did that assistance look like? We're always excited to see case studies. And I'll flick on over to Steve now.
Thank you, Milo. Move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just as a background of the macadamia industry, there's just a map there showing the current geographic spread of macadamia plantings down the east coast of Australia. So they basically span from Nambucca in the south through to the Atherton Tablelands in the north, although the majority of crop now is grown sort of in the Northern Rivers and Bundaberg regions. So historically, through the 80s and 90s, the industry was centred around Lismore and the Northern Rivers. It's an area with particularly high rainfall, good quality soils, and a very subtropical climate that's ideal for growing macadamias. More recently, the industry, probably through the early 2000s, sort of 2000 to 2005, started to kick off in Bundaberg. Obviously, it offered sugarcane and small crop growers up there an alternative crop, and that area has continued to expand in planting since then, and is now the largest producing area of macadamias in Australia. Annually, there's about 3,000 hectares of land that's being planted with macadamias, and most of that is in that Bundaberg region, although that's now starting to move into other areas such as Maryborough and also through the Clarence Valley and coastal New South Wales regions. Next slide, please. So Marquis Macadamias operates two facilities. So the top image there is our Lismore factory that was commenced operations in 1983, and the lower picture there is of our Bundaberg factory that started operations in 2012 in response to the increased production in that region. So basically in 1983, there was 4 macadamia growers got together and decided that they were going to take control of their crop and their processing and marketing of their produce, and started the Lismore facility. It started off processing around 30 tonnes a year and has, at some stages of its evolution, been the largest processing facility of macadamias in the world. The Bundaberg factory is currently able to meet our growers' supply in Bundaberg, but we've got plans for expansion up there as well to keep up to the growing crop. As a business, we're an unlisted public company, but we, being 100% grower owned, so under our constitution, you have to be a macadamia grower to be a shareholder, and that allows us to qualify as a cooperative under tax law. So that's useful for us as a business in terms of accessing cooperative tax loans. So we've got about 250 to 300 growers that supply us, and they range in size from small mum and dad farmers that might produce 5 or 10 tonnes annually up to the largest macadamia grower in the world, and large commercial investors that are now entering the industry. We are heavily export dependent, so we export about 80% of the produce that we manufacture, and that's to a broad range of markets that I'll touch on shortly. At the moment, we've got about 28,000 tonnes of processing capacity, but we've got plans to expand that fairly significantly over the next 5 to 10 years as our shareholder supply base grows and the crop that they produce increases. We process between 30 and 40% of the Australian crop, and we're increasing the percentage of crop of our products that are value added. So trying to extract more value rather than just participate in bulk wholesale markets. Next slide, please. In terms of export markets, as I said, there's about 80% of what we produce is exported, and that's got a pretty good geographic spread. You can see there that we're exporting to quite a number of end markets. I think there's 45 countries that we export to. And we also, our marketing company also sells product from some supply partners that we have in Kenya and South Africa, just to increase the volumes of offerings that we have available to our end customers. And that's across a spread of end use markets as well. So we've been basically supplying snack food, confectionery ingredients, baked goods and health food sectors in that spread of markets. So our processing steps are pretty simple. So the growers harvest the nuts. The nuts are picked up off the ground when they fall from the tree. They're delivered to our factory. We do some sampling and analysis of those deliveries and determine the quality of the consignments. The consignments are then transferred into drying systems where we very carefully dry the nuts under controlled temperature and humidity conditions prior to processing. Processing involves cracking the nuts, so cracking that hard shell to liberate the kernel. We then use a whole range of mechanical separation steps to remove the shell from the kernel, with a pretty high dependency on technology and automation through colour sorting and the like to separate shell from kernel, but also different quality grades of kernel from each other. So then endpoint testing and a final step of pasteurisation to make sure the product is microbially safe for human consumption prior to packaging. So we vacuum seal the macadamia kernel in aluminium gas flush bags, so they're nitrogen flushed and packed under vacuum, which gives them a particularly long shelf life, which is important through the supply chain. Next slide, please. So we've invested very heavily at both of our facilities, primarily around automation and new technology. A lot of the countries that we're competing against, the South Africas, Kenyas and China's, have got relatively low labour rates. So we're in a high cost labour environment. We need high levels of automation and rely on technology to keep our processing costs down, and rely on points of difference such as our pasteurisation to provide food safe products. And also around energy efficiency as well. So we burn some of our waste shell to generate some of the thermal energy that we use for drying our nut in shells. So macadamia shell is a very good fuel source. It has about the same energy value as low grade coal, so it burns exceptionally well. Next slide, please. We're working constantly on product development and innovation, just trying to provide a more diversified offering to our customer base and grow a new customer base as well. So Just some examples of that are some of our honey roasted products and honey roasted chip there that's being used as ingredients into some other baked goods. There's a product in the middle top there that you probably haven't seen before. It's a sawn nut in shell. So that's a product that's extremely popular in China. It didn't exist 10 years ago, and now it consumes around sort of 20 to 25% of the whole world's macadamia crop gets consumed in that type of format. So it's an example of where innovation has really driven demand and consumption in the macadamia industry. We're also expanding our offerings of oil. So basically our reject kernel and byproducts get pressed to oil, and they're can be used in cosmetics or food grade, and examples in retail packs there. And we also make different levels of paste that can be used into non-dairy milks or as ingredients into baked goods. Next slide, please. And retail. So we're, as part of that value add process, we do quite a lot of retail packing. So there's a lot of products on the Australian supermarkets and also supermarket shelves throughout Asia that are packed in our facilities. And that gives us an opportunity to be closer to the end consumer, and basically provides us better feedback on what's happening in those markets around demand and product quality and things like that. So it's been an important thing for our business. Next slide. So as a grower-owned business, we're always looking at ways to improve our offerings to our growers and help them improve their productivity. So we do hold a lot of field days and information sessions with our growers around topics that can help them be more productive, but also more environmentally friendly as well. So things around insect pest management, canopy management, orchard floor management to stop erosion and things like that. So there's quite a strong focus on that and offering extension services to all of our shareholders. Next slide, please. That extends to some centralised investment in sorting infrastructure. So rather than rely on growers to sort all of their nuts on farm, we've invested in sorting equipment at both of our factories to help reduce the cost and labour involved in growers sorting on farm through centralised investment at our processing facilities. And that also helps, I suppose, in terms of the amenity on farm, reducing the amount of noise generated on farm and hopefully keeping some of the neighbours happy. Next slide, please. So in terms of employment, it was about 420 employees when we were at full tilt. That does vary a little bit through the year with the seasonality of the business, but there's a whole range of different types of skills that we employ through both factories and also through our marketing, sales, and logistics team that are based in Brisbane. And there's obviously a flow-on effect there as well with the employees directly on farm, but also through the service industries that support macadamia farming and processing. Next slide, please. This is a painting of what the factory looked like. I think it's fairly shortly after construction in 1983. I think there were a couple of considerations around where the site selection was, and one of those was that it happened to be on a farm that was owned by one of the original members of the company. So the four growers that got together to build MPC and Macadamia Processing Company, and it's back in 1983. It did have fairly good road access frontage because there was a small cafe and things associated with the site at the time, but that's changed over time. I think in the first year of operation, they processed around 30 tonnes of nuts across the whole year, and we currently process that in a couple of hours. So quite a contrast in terms of the size and scale of what the processing operation can handle, and probably well and truly exceeded their expectations on the growth of the business. And one of those constraints relates to treatment of wastewater streams. So in the early days, you can see there's a couple of tanks on the left there. Basically, that was would collect the wastewater and would use evaporation trenches to let that water evaporate and drain. As the factory got bigger and more complicated, we needed to install a wastewater treatment plant to remove the oils from the wastewater and pump that 2 kilometres to the closest council sewer. So probably never was considered at the initial inception of expansion on that site that would be a complication that would be encountered. Next slide, please. Over the evolution of the business, there's been a number of different methods of construction employed. There's a lot of expanded polystyrene cold room panel used, particularly in the earlier construction. It was a very cheap and efficient method of construction and complied with all the building code requirements. Unfortunately, there's been a number of very large factory fires around the world. Basically, once that panel catches fire, it's very, very difficult to extinguish. And whilst all of our buildings comply with the building code, they don't meet the requirements of insurance these days. So we've had to upgrade the levels of fire protection above the original building code requirements and install fire protection, fire sprinklers throughout the entire site. Obviously, that's put pressure on the supply of water to the site. And next slide, please, Milo. And we've had to install some very large tanks and pumps and things to accommodate the requirements for water flow and volumes of storage to facilitate the operation of those sprinklers. Next slide, please, Milo. Electricity is something that's also undergone a number of upgrades over time. You see the slide on the left there is, I think it's probably the second or third upgrade of connection to the site, and that was a 750 kVA transformer that was located adjacent to the building with a very short connection of between the transformer and our main switchboard that was just inside the factory. With some upgrades that happened about 10 years ago, we had to install a 1.5 MVA transformer. With rules changing in essential energy, that had to be located further away from the building and required a much longer run of cable to our switchboard. And at the end of all that, so that was all done at our expense. And at the end of that, we gift that back to Essential Energy for ownership and maintenance, ongoing maintenance. Next slide, please, Milo. We're located in a beautiful area just outside of Lismore. There's nice, quiet surrounds. It's not your typical factory site, but one of the challenges with that is that we are in a koala habitat. So you can see there's very large gum trees that surround the perimeter of our factory, and they add to our bushfire risk in terms of should they catch fire, they would well and truly fall onto the building should they catch fire. And we're now in the process of installing external sprinklers around some of the perimeters of our buildings as a requirement to comply with insurance for fire risk. Next slide, please. On our site, we've also got a yellow box, and that box is actually an old cattle dip site. That land is not actually owned by Marquis Macadamias. It's a small annex to our land holding, and it's basically, I suppose, within our site, it's an area that we can't develop, so it puts a bit of a constraint on our plans for future expansion and limits, I suppose, what we can do at that site. We have had some discussions with DPI and lands around what we can do with that, and there are some complications around it, and that it doesn't have particularly good access. It's not actually costing DPI anything at the moment because we maintain it. We mow it as part of our site hygiene requirements, and it's got a fairly low value, I suppose, in terms of it. If it was remediated, if it was put on open market, it probably wouldn't have much value to anyone else other than us. But should that area be remediated, it would certainly assist us in terms of what we could do with that site, and it would be fairly valuable real estate for us. Next slide, please, Milo. We currently have some challenges with access to our site with the population growth on the northern rivers and traffic flow along the Bruxner Highway that's outside of our facility. That's created a fairly dangerous intersection. There are plans with the state government to upgrade that intersection, and hopefully that will improve the safety of that roadway for our staff and also for our growers that deliver to us. One of the considerations in around that is we've been talking to the local council just around the timing of the implementation. Obviously, when we're in the middle of peak deliveries, that would not be a great time to be closing the road and reducing traffic flow to our site or congesting traffic flow to our site when we can be receiving 200 tonnes of nut deliveries a day during peak season. So that's just maintaining ongoing dialogue there and making sure we're involved in that planning process. Next slide, please, Milo. So as I said, we operate the two facilities, so there is quite a bit of movement of product between the two factories. There are some things that we only do at each facility rather than duplicate infrastructure. We have some particular operations that only run at one of the sites. So it is about a 570k journey between the two facilities. And similarly for our export, we're moving trucks and primarily containerised loads of kernel and nut and shell for export. That's about 200 odd kilometres to the port of Brisbane. So actually all of our export product goes out through the port of Brisbane. Next slide, please, Milo. So the challenge with that is that from either of those locations, be it the Port of Brisbane or Bundaberg, if we're bringing product to our site in B-double trucks, the last 200 metres from the Bruxner Highway to our front gate is not B-double approved. So basically, next slide, please, Milo. So the red line there is not trafficable by B-doubles. So basically, trucks currently have to drive from Bundaberg or the Port of Brisbane all the way down to our site and uncouple one trailer and then deliver single trailers or single containers to our facility, go back, pick up the second container or trailer and bring that into our facility and then go back and recouple. So they're actually doubling the amount of traffic flow movements across the intersection that unfortunately the turning radius on that corner is not compatible with B-doubles, and we've had Main Roads come out and conduct some testing with us and combined with the local council. So whilst they've tried to help us with the current design, it's just not feasible to run B-doubles through there at the moment. But the new design does rectify that. Next slide, please, Milo. One of the other issues is that our Lismore factory is not that far inland from Byron, and if you listen to the real estate agents, the Byron Bay hinterland stretches a fair way inland these days. It's a highly sought after area for tree changes, I suppose. We've got direct flights to both Sydney and Melbourne out of Ballina-Byron Airport, and with work from home and NBN connections and the like, it's becoming more and more feasible for people that work predominantly in the city to move to the rural area. Next slide, please, Milo. And that creates some challenges, I suppose, in terms of their expectations of their nice, quiet little slice of paradise when macadamias growers have to go out and spray their crops often of an evening to minimise the impact on non-target pests. And also operate things like dehusking sheds that can be quite noisy. So obviously there's a potential conflict there between growers and the ever-increasing sort of tree change movement into traditional growing areas. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Steve. That's a really good example of seeing how far a good set of processing facilities can take a local industry, that wouldn't be able to get that, that value out of their product on their own going through wholesale. I understand Steve's got to run off, but if you have any questions for him, chuck them into the chat and yeah, we'll again, we'll take them on notice and we'll get it back to you in our resources. And now for a contrasting kind of industry, we're going to hear from John Harvie, the Mayor of Murray River Council, who has helped out a lot with the recently up and running Barham micro abattoir. We'll hand over to you now, John.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Milo. I'll try and be as quick as I can with this one. Thank you for the invitation and to tell the story of the Barham Micro Abattoir. Barham is a small town on the Murray River. It's about 280 kilometres north of Melbourne, and it has quite a number of local producers who produce poultry, sheep, goat, buffalo and cattle, and they process them in small numbers. The abattoir itself is operated by Murray Plains Meat Co-operative, which is a producer cooperative in the area. If we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see that the abattoir is an American-style barn. That's very simple. There are very few micro abattoirs operating around Australia at the time of construction and even now. We were lucky enough to find a contractor who was an owner-operator of one of these micro abattoirs, and he was able to design the facility, and he chose the form of an American-style barn. Next slide. This is a photo from a distance. The actual size of the facility is 13 metres wide by 30 metres in length, but that includes the pens at the end of the building. You can see here that we obviously had to bring some power to the site, and the yellow oblong object you can see there is a generator. It's a diesel generator, and that's to provide continuity of power in a power outage. Unfortunately, Barham is at the end of the essential energy network and has a few brownouts and blackouts. So if the power goes out, the generator automatically turns on and continues to provide power, which is really important because that we're dealing with perishable meat products. We need it particularly for the chillers to ensure that all the processed livestock or processed animals are kept chilled. Next slide. I'll go through these reasonably quickly. This is just a pen. It's very difficult to see. These are the pens in the receiving area. We have some buffalo in those pens at the moment. The abattoir, being a micro abattoir, will not process animals larger than 500 kilograms live weight. We leave that to the commercial abattoirs. Next slide. So these are lambs in the pen, buffalo behind them there, waiting for processing. Next slide shows poultry receival bay. We receive the poultry, chickens and ducks in crates, and they are taken in the side entrance there, and that's where the poultry processing commences. Next slide shows that our water supply had to come quite a distance, probably 2 kilometres. And rather than just connect treated water and raw water up to the facility itself, we felt it was better to have some redundancy there. We've got 2 tanks, one for raw water and one for treated water. And they're sufficient there should the water supply be turned off or we lose access to water for any time. There's sufficient in there to process 1 and probably 1.5 days processing. The next slide shows our stormwater retention pond. We have drainage that runs from the 7 hectares of land through an open drain and culvert under the road to this 1 megalitre dam that we use for irrigating trees and the likes. And you can see it's a pretty good season down here at the moment. We don't normally have as much rain as we've had, and we've got prolific growth going on around the place. So next slide, the need was to provide a local livestock processing facility for producers. And the issue was really the unreliability of large commercial abattoirs. And due to perhaps seasonal closures, because abattoirs are, commercial abattoirs are subject to seasonal closures and times of drought and so on. So they're not always guaranteed to be operating. Processing space was not guaranteed in times of abundance when the commercial operators are operating at full speed and capacity for their own livestock. They will just, with probably very little notice, say, look, we really can't process your small numbers of livestock. Next slide down shows the long distance travel up to 300 kilometres, which resulted in stressed livestock. The 300 kilometres is because the local abattoirs within 100 kilometres and 80 kilometres sometimes wouldn't have processing capacity, and therefore the livestock would have to be taken into central Victoria and could result in a one-way trip of 300 kilometres. The animals get very stressed, particularly in the hot weather, and that produces very poor quality meat. So next slide, we had to come up with a solution. And the solution, next slide, was a multi-species micro-abattoir that can process up to 3,000 kilograms of carcass weight each day. So that's a weight of meat, or 700 tonnes per annum. Some commercial abattoirs, believe it or not, would produce this in an hour or two. So it gives you the idea, and this was something that some near neighbours couldn't grasp, the idea of a micro abattoir. When you talk of abattoirs, obviously they get connotations of things like odour and so on. But a micro abattoir is limited in the amount of livestock it can process. So next slide shows us we're going inside the facility. Here we have staff processing chickens whilst they're being audited. There's an audit in process. The local council does an annual inspection. Our inspector does an annual inspection of the facility from a health point of view. And of course, the state government undertakes annual audits and sometimes unannounced audits if complaints around the things being received. The facility, the quality is controlled within the facility under their own HACCP plan, hazard analysis and critical control point plan. I'll move on to the next slide, and you'll see here, this is buffalo being processed. The animal is there, it's had the head removed, hocks removed, and now the process operator is starting to take the skin from the animal. Next slide, you can see here some carcass processed goat, which are at the offal collection station, so liver, kidneys, and things like that. And even in the background there, you can see that heads are being collected. And the carcass there are ready just to go straight into the chiller from there. Also on the next slide, we have, we process medium livestock, goats, as I say. We also have pigs, which go from very small pigs, which are used for bacon and the like, and then right up to fairly heavy sows, where that meat is then cut up into cuts and or used to be minced and made into salamis, locally made and branded salamis. So if we go to the next slide, we see there that the solution that we came up with for these issues that we had was a multi-species micro-abattoir. And the benefits of that, next slide, is to reduce food miles and certainly keep the animals from stressing. Most of the animals that are processed and livestock, poultry, are grown within 20 to 30 kilometres and some up to 50 kilometres away, but mostly within that 20 to 30 kilometre radius. Next slide, which really gives us less strived livestock and better quality meat. And when I say better quality meat, if you were to go to a butcher or a supermarket and look at meat, if the meat is very dark coloured, that is an indication of an animal that's been processed while it's been stressed. And a few things that can cause stress, for example, some animals have their bellies washed, or the cutting lines where you take the skin off, those lines are washed, and generally if you're in the winter, you're washing them with warm water. So it's a spray that comes up from underneath. If for some reason the water is not hot and it's freezing cold, that'll stress the animal. Transporting at long distances will stress the animal, and poor treatment of the animal will stress the animal. Next slide, please. And the other benefit was guaranteed and timely processing, so that our local producers knew their animals were going to be processed when they were ready to be processed and when their customers required the products that the producers, the branding that they produce. Most of the producers who send the livestock in are artisans who have their own brand of meat and they have their own customers, but we also have families who purchase livestock and then have it processed there so that they know what meat they're getting. One other issue is that when you send your livestock into large commercial facilities, it can very easily, unless they're using QR code technology and so on, it can be very easy to lose sight of what is your animal compared to what is someone else's, and therefore you don't always get your animal carcass back, and that's very, very important for the producers. Next slide. The project manager was going to be Murray Plains Meat Co-operative for this project. However, Murray River Council got involved when the government funders for various funding programs that Murray Plains Meat Co-operative was seeking funding from wouldn't give the money to the cooperative because they didn't have trading history, particularly financial trading history. And as a result, we were contacted by both Murray Plains Meat Co-operative and the departments administering those funds to say, hey guys, would you take on the project management and be the owner of the facility for a period of time? Next slide. So this is the site. One of the important things, the site is this little area. You can see it there just in the middle to the top. It's got a red dot in it. It's a 7-hectare site. It's about 5 kilometres from Barham town centre, and its zoning is RU1 rural. We go to the next slide. We did find some land use conflicts. We had some near neighbours who are just very close to the abattoir. I'm not sure that I can point to it, but they're within, their property is within 620 metres, and their homes and residences are about 700 metres from the site. And as you can see there, we've got Eagle Creek at the very bottom of that. that site. The site is part of a former dairy farm, and in fact the dairy farmer's house is the closest recipient at just on 500 metres from the site. But they were very supportive, whereas the people at the 700 metre mark were quite vocal in their fear of the abattoir being built in that location. The next slide shows, next couple of slides, they show that their main concerns were odour and noise. And if I go back, odour, then noise, then waste. They wondered what was going to happen to the waste, what would that contribute to odours and so on. Next slide. The other problem they had, or the issue they thought they'd have, is that their home is on the intersection of Barham to Moolameen main road and Gone Road, where the abattoir is located. So it's on the intersection of Gone and that highway, and they thought increased traffic would cause some real issues. If we go to the next slide, the next issue that we had to get was the funding. Where was the funding going to come from? And the next slide was that, as I spoke earlier about the collaboration between Murray River Council and Murray Plains Meat Co-operative to secure some grant funding. And it just shows you there, we received a total of just over $2 million in funding from those grant programs that you can see there. Next slide. There were some, as I say, those planning issues was zone. The zone was RU1. It was identified by Murray Plains Meat Co-operative as quite an ideal site. It's not too far out of town, but it's also only got very low density in terms of residences within that area. As I say, RU1, land use conflicts, the next slide. We'll go through them. So the near neighbours concerns, we heard them at public meetings, but we also met with them on 2 or 3 occasions to talk to them and run them through what we were going to do within the project, but it didn't seem to allay their concerns. Next slide. So that slide there shows you a sequence batch reactor technology treatment system to treat the plant's waste effluent, which generally, the waste within that is generally small amounts of blood. The treated effluent from there goes through that system, comes out treated into a collection tank, and provided quality checks are okay, in wet times, that can be pumped into the stormwater drain if in an emergency, but it doesn't happen generally. It goes straight through that tank and is pumped into a wick trench area of around about 0.6 of a hectare of wick trenching. And given that we're talking probably 2,000 litres of effluent a day, it's not I think this is a bit of overkill, actually. Next slide shows there were concerns about the noise, but all of the equipment, plant and equipment that we've put in there and the distance we are from those receptors, it's now been operating for almost a year, and there's been no complaints of noise whatsoever. Waste, what you can see on the screen, next slide, is what we call a bio-bowser. This one's a BB750, which means it can take 750 kilograms per batch of other waste materials. So the waste materials include things like feathers from poultry. It includes pieces of offal and paunch, stomach materials and that are not collected. That will turn that waste into compost within 24 hours and can produce from 50 to 70 kilograms of compost each day, which is then collected. So the only thing that goes out or off the site is actually the skins and hides from the animals, and they're kept there for probably 2, 3, 4 days. And the other thing are the carcass and the offal. So as you can see, the only thing that comes out at the end of the processing day is compost and some skins and hides to be taken off site. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Next slide. And if you've got any questions, happy to answer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, no, that was another really good and contrasting example of of producers getting together and trying to solve their own issues with the supply chain, and with the good assistance of council there. So we've hit up to time. We're going to run a little way over, as we often do, if there's, to the extent that there's any questions, but we're going to record everything, and anything we don't get to, we'll send out in the resources afterwards. We'll also be flicking out a recording afterwards too, in coming weeks, once we just get it a bit organized. It might send out an automatic one. Please just ignore that. We'll close it off and make sure it works, our edits and everything in there. On the way out, if you have the capacity to answer a quick survey about this, that'd be great too. I think Sel should be able to link that into the chat if she hasn't already. And without further ado, let's see if we got any questions. We don't have too many so far, but please keep adding them if you're still here. And now we have a question about the wastewater treatment, John, for the treatment plant sequence batched. I think they were just trying to get a bit of extra info on how that exactly works.
Yes, so that the large tank has bayonets which introduce air into the system, which has been, I suppose, charged using bacterial material that contains microbes in the base. We generally get that if we lose that biological activity, we get that from waste coming out of sewage treatment plants. So that's sludge. So it's sludge activated. Sludge is the name. And that starts the process, so that when the water goes in there, that tank itself can take 4 or 5 days waste. So it takes about 2 or 3 days to go through that whole process. And the air helps to, I suppose, flocculate, and if there is any sort of solids in there at all, which there shouldn't be, because each drain within the facility has a mesh cage, and that collects any solid materials, which then goes into the biobowser for processing. It's an Australian company that makes these things. I'm just trying to think of their name. Anyway, I can get that to you, Milo.
Yeah, no, that's great. Like we said, I think in our presentation, it's a really good example of smaller modular systems that are starting to appear and become more and more accessible at smaller scales. I'll just quickly speak to this question we got about the impacts on intensive agriculture of second dwellings being sought with relaxed planning controls in rural zones. We showed you that image of the reverse odor modeling exercise that was for the poultry sector. Not everything's going to need a 1 kilometre buffer, but it's the same principle that applies throughout landscapes. We know there's a lot of reasons why people might be seeking secondary dwellings, but and that might be things like farm secession and these kind of ideas, but we tend to apply a lot of caution to that, because I think as planners know it can be really hard to enforce these kind of things and make sure that dwellings are going to continue to be used in association with agriculture. So yeah, you've got to be really careful with that to not inadvertently create these rural landscapes, especially in highly productive areas, which we hope most of the rural zone land can be. Doesn't become inadvertently sterilized through that process, more or less for good, through pockmarks of unstrategic kind of planning decisions, when housing, in most cases could and should be directed to strategically identified areas. But we could talk about that all day, and we often do. John, did you have anything else to add to? So you mentioned the hides and skin going off-site for treatment. What about bones and heads? Does that just go with the rest of the waste into the composting system?
The facility has got a boning room, but that's not operational at the present time. Therefore, the bones are still in the carcass when they leave the facility and go to the butcher or to the producer who has their own cut-up rooms and so on.
And where do the hides and skins go? Does that go to a number of different people looking to process them?
Yes, look, I think what happens is they've got a preferred hide and skin buyer, and they negotiate prices for skins at the time, depending on how much wool or what condition they're in. So from time to time, they will offer it out to other buyers just to make sure that they're getting the right price for it.
All right, we have another one. What particular legacy issues exist for small producers competing with large-scale suppliers? Well, it's kind of like we said, a lot of them are being pushed out. The growth in productivity of productivity of the food systems is really important to being able to feed the entire population. Obviously, I think, like we said, with that figure of something like 3.36 million birds a week being processed by that BIRD plant, it's sometimes hard to conceive of that happening through another system. But there's these very important values that these smaller processors bring, like we said. Going back to that landline show on micro abattoirs the other week. That would be a really good start for that. I don't know if you got anything else to add, though, John. What are some legacy issues for small producers that got to compete?
Well, they don't necessarily have to compete because they have their own markets and restaurants and so on that they supply. So they're not competing in, say, the export market where most of the big commercial people are. They have their own butchers that they supply. They have their own restaurants that they supply. And of course, local butchers process their livestock there. So they're not competing with the large commercial abattoirs as well. So, and generally speaking, the meat processed at the small facility here is not halal. So most of the commercial abattoirs have theirs processed according to the Muslim faith, and that gives them access to markets all over the world. So this is really for domestic consumption.
Yeah, and that link to to local markets and local branding and local retailers is really important too. So you can see what the implications are of removing some of these components, how it can have a flow-on effect through to your butchers, through to your restaurants, and so on, and your local tourist economy, and that happening at all sorts of different scales, but especially in those local settings.
If there's anyone still here who wants to know who the company is that built that small plant, the company is Aerofloat. And I think they're based in New South Wales. Let me have a quick look here.
We can put through a link as an example in our follow-up resources as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So where's Caringbah? That's in Sydney, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Let me see. Maybe not.
Nice.
Sorry, it's Queensland.
Oh, okay.
Oh no, it's not. It's Sydney. It's around Sydney.
A
so
local one anyway.
Yeah, Aerofloat. Yeah.
One other thing we actually, maybe that will be it for questions unless anyone wants to squeeze anything in, but thanks so much for attending. Like we said, we'll flick out the, the resources in the next couple of weeks, including the recording and any of these other things we've mentioned. Also want to highlight, though, I don't know if we have a link quite handy, we'll definitely have it in the follow-up resources. We've just released, as of yesterday, the My Farm Planner tool, which is an interactive tool for producers, farmers in a couple of different industries to do kind of development assessment audits for their site if they have particular developments in mind. Here's a link Sal's put up, which lets them go through potential developments on their site and get some kind of some high level advice on what some of the planning legislation and requirements are, and that's intended to kind of assist when they come to put things through a DA stage and give them a bit more confidence. We'd love planners to go and have a look around at it. You might know it, or you might find some things you're not sure about there, or you might have some advice on how to tinker with it going forward. Who knows? We'd be really interested to know how you all use it in addition to planners themselves. I don't think we have any processes on there yet, but be interested to see how it expands as it's used and going forward. Have a play around with that.
Well, just a quick one too. One of the things that we did wrong was we used our own planners for to process a development application. And we noticed as we went through that was going to be an issue, given that we had closed receptors that were not happy with that. So we sent the entire development application together with our approval documentation out to an independent third party for a peer review, just to make sure that we had covered everything. And that peer review came back with a couple of extra reports that we really were required to go out and get from another independent source. So
that's a great tip, and yeah, you get in those situations because you're just feeling your way out of an evolving process and an evolving concept. And I'm sure it goes without saying, John and his council would be happy to be contacted by anyone who's thinking about any similar kind of development, whether that's a micro abattoir or something else similar to assist with. I'm sure there's oodles of insight you got there. We'll put your contact details in when we put together the follow-up too. With that, we might leave it there and let you get on with your days. Thanks so much for coming. We really enjoy these, and we hope you get a lot out of a very short amount of time to attend. But yeah, hopefully the start of many more conversations in this space. We'll catch you for the next ones.